Welcome, everyone. Today we're going deep on the disappearance of Anonet Cayito.
Yeah, this one's really got to me, to be honest.
I know, right? The crime junkie episode you sent, it's just left me with so many questions.
Absolutely. And, these cases involving missing children are always heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But this one's got some extra layers.
Totally. So to kick things off, can you give us a sense of Gallup, New Mexico back then, like in 1986?
Sure. So Gallup in 86,
Mm-hmm.
and a tight-knit community very much influenced by its closeness to the Navajo Nation.
I gotcha. Not a huge city, but not exactly a sleepy town either.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
A place where everyone knew their neighbors and word got around fast, sometimes a little too fast.
Gotcha. So it's in this town that 9-year-old Anonet vanishes from her home.
It seems like overnight, just poof, gone.
Now, in your experience, what would investigators have done first back then? I mean, was it different in the 80s?
Oh, definitely different. Back in 86, DNA analysis was basically brand new. They relied a lot on what people saw talking to everyone in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And just good old-fashioned detective work.
Makes sense. So that's where things start to get messy, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's conflicting stories about if the doors were locked, and then there's Sunita Anonet's little sister talking about those knocks at the door.
Right. And, Sunita, she was so young.
5 years old, right?
Exactly. So she might have mixed up what she remembers with a dream or something.
Happens all the time.
Especially in situations that are really stressful. But what she said about those people saying they were their aunt and uncle, that's a big red flag for me.
Totally. It makes you think, were the abductors, were they trying to, trick Anonet?
Yeah, you could see that. Make her feel safe so she'd open the door.
It's scary to even think about. So did the investigators, in their initial search, did they find anyone who fit the profile of a child abductor? Someone who targeted girls her age?
Well, they did come across this guy, Wesley Daniels.
I've read about him.
Yeah, he was a registered sex offender and lived in the area. Obviously, that makes him a person of interest. But, when they looked closer at Daniels' past offenses, they saw a very clear pattern. He only targeted young boys.
So very specific.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon, actually. It makes it much less likely that Daniels was involved in Anonet's case.
Another dead end. So frustrating for everyone involved, I bet.
Absolutely. Early leads are crucial. And when they lead nowhere, the pressure builds. And unfortunately, in Anonet's case, it seems like some of that frustration got directed at her mother, Penny.
I can see that happening. The public often jumps to conclusions before they have all the facts.
It's a natural human thing to do, but it can cause so much damage, especially to the family. Imagine you're a parent grieving and then you have to defend yourself against accusations.
It's just adding more pain.
Exactly. A whole other layer of trauma. And in this case, that trauma got even worse a year later when that phone call came in.
Yeah, you mentioned that one during our prep call. Said it was a really important piece of evidence.
It is. You actually send over the recording, and I think we should listen to it together. It's short, but powerful.
Okay, let's hear it.
Here we go.
Wow, that's chilling. Even after all these years, that sends chills down my spine. You mentioned that both Penny and the police thought it was Anonet, but can't you easily imitate a kid's voice on the phone?
Yeah, you can. But Penny specifically said she recognized how Anonet said their last name. It's a subtle detail hard to fake.
So in your experience, how often does a missing child make direct contact like this?
It's rare. And what's even weirder is that she knew the direct police line. Think about it. This was before 911 was everywhere, so it means she had some local knowledge.
So she had to be from the area. It does make it seem less like some random prank call.
Right. It seems more credible.
So we have this phone call that sounds real, but it just raises more questions. What happens next? Did the call lead anywhere? It did. There was a ton of activity. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they got a tip about a girl in Seattle who looked like Anonet.
Seattle? That's so far from Gallup. Was there any connection?
As far as we know, no. The tip came from a school teacher who noticed a new student. She looked like Anonet, and there were no school records for her.
That's suspicious. Yeah, so the FBI got involved, tracked down the girl, and, well, you guessed it. It wasn't Anonet.
Figures. Another dead end.
Turned out she was from Saudi Arabia, caught up in some complicated family stuff. Another frustrating dead end. Especially after that little bit of hope from the phone call.
Is heartbreaking. And speaking of hope turning into disappointment, there was that note, right? The one found in Carson City, Nevada.
Oh yeah, that note. That one really gets to you. Because the waitress who found it, she said Anonet kept squeezing her hand every time she bent down.
Oh, wow. Like she was trying to connect with someone, anyone.
Right. And then to leave that note, it just makes you think, what if she was so close to being rescued?
I know, it's just awful. The timing is weird too, right? The waitress went to the police after hearing Anonet's phone call on the radio months after she saw her at the diner.
Exactly. What if the police had released that recording sooner?
It really makes you think about how important it is to get the word out, you know? Even a tiny detail, if it's shared at the right time, it could change everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even with all these dead ends and missed chances, there's a big twist coming.
Yeah, years later, right. Anonet's youngest sister, Wendy, she comes forward and says she actually saw what happened.
It's a huge turning point in the case. And you have to remember, Wendy was carrying this secret around for years.
Imagine that a little kid having to live with that memory. It must have been terrifying. She was only 5.
Right, and it's not unusual for kids to wait a long time before they talk about something traumatic. But what Wendy eventually told the police was really significant.
So what did she say?
She described 2 men showing up at their house in a brown van. They called themselves Uncle Joe.
Just like Sanita said. So it wasn't just a kid making things up. Those knocks at the door, the Uncle Joe trick. It was all planned out.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
And even though the real Uncle Joe was eventually ruled out, this new information changed the whole investigation. It meant that whoever took Anonet, they knew something about her family.
Which makes it a lot less likely to be a random abduction, right?
Right? It adds a whole other layer of creepiness to the case. Someone close enough to know about their family using that information to gain their trust. It's chilling.
It is. And finding out all of this so much later, it must have been devastating for everyone, especially Wendy.
Absolutely. Think about it. She probably felt guilty all those years, like she could have done something to stop it. The impact on her must have been huge. And for the whole family, it was like reopening an old wound, only to find out it was even deeper than they thought.
Right, and you mentioned before how Penny relied a lot on Navajo traditions to help her cope. Did that play a role in how she dealt with Wendy's revelation?
It seems so. She talked to medicine women looking for guidance and comfort in those ancient ceremonies. One even said that Anonet was still alive and might even have a child of her own now.
Wow. I mean, that's hopeful in a way, but also kind of heartbreaking, you know? If it's true, it makes you think about what kind of life she might be living.
Exactly. It's one of those details that gives you a mix of emotions. And it shows how complicated things can get when you're trying to balance cultural beliefs with a police investigation.
So even with Wendy's testimony and the police working the case again, it still went unsolved. It's hard to believe that after all this time, there are still so many unanswered questions.
It is. And it just shows how frustrating these cases can be. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, they just go cold.
But there's more to the story, right? Didn't you mention something about the case being looked at again years later?
Yeah, in 2005, the Gallup Police Department decided to take another look at Anonet's case. They were going through a bunch of cold cases, hoping to find something new.
Sometimes fresh eyes can make all the difference.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like they found anything new. But the fact that they even tried after all that time shows how determined they were to find some answers.
I respect that. And the FBI got involved too, right? You mentioned something about them doing outreach in Native communities.
This is actually one of the most puzzling parts of the story. In 2022, the FBI, for the first time ever, reached out directly to Indigenous communities as part of their work on missing persons cases. They even made posters in Navajo and recorded audio clips about Anonet's case.
The first time ever. That's crazy. Why do you think it took so long for them to do that?
It's a tough question. For 2 long cases about missing and murdered, Indigenous people just weren't given enough attention or resources. It's finally starting to change, but there's still a long way to go.
It's frustrating. You can't help but think about how different things might be if they had done that outreach from the beginning.
You're right. But there's a little bit of hope in all of this. Anonet's sister Wendy, she still believes that Anonet is alive somewhere.
That's amazing after all these years to hold on to that belief. It says a lot about the power of family.
It really does. Even when families go through something this awful, that bond is still there. It's a little bit of light in a very dark story.
Okay, so we're about to wrap up this part of our deep dive, but I keep coming back to that phone call. What if it wasn't really Anonet?
That's a good question to ask. We've talked about the possibility of a hoax, but if it wasn't her, then who was it? And why would they make that call?
Could it have been someone trying to throw off the investigation? You know, maybe even protect the people who really took her?
It's a scary thought. If the investigators were being led in the wrong direction on purpose, it would explain why this case is still unsolved.
It's crazy. We've looked at the evidence, considered different angles, and we still don't have a clear answer about what happened to Anonet.
It's definitely frustrating.
Yeah.
But I think there's still something to be gained by digging into all of this.
Yeah.
You know, by looking at the mistakes and the missed opportunities, we can learn from what happened and maybe prevent something like this from happening again.
That's a good point. But before we get too deep into that, I want to go back to something that's been bothering me. The brown van. Just seems like it's everywhere in this case. A neighbor says they saw one parked outside Penny's house the morning Anonet vanished, and then Wendy describes a similar van during the abduction.
It definitely makes you wonder. It could be a genuine clue, or it could be a total red herring, something to throw everyone off. Think about it, a brown van is pretty generic, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's not exactly memorable.
Exactly. Easy to miss, easy to forget.
Yeah.
If you wanted to blend and disappear into the background, a brown van would be the perfect choice.
It's like the opposite of a flashy getaway car. You'd never suspect it.
Right. So was it just a random van that happened to be there, or did they pick it on purpose? And if they did, what does that tell us about them?
Were they super organized or just trying to cover their tracks in the simplest way possible?
Exactly. It's a detail that deserves another look.
It's so interesting how something as ordinary as a brown van can become such a big deal in a case like this. It reminds you that every single detail is important, even the ones that seem totally random.
Couldn't agree more. And sometimes the most important clues are the ones that don't fit with what we think a crime should look like.
It's true. So we have all these pieces of information, the phone call, Uncle Joe, the brown van, but it still doesn't add up to a clear picture. It's like we're missing a key piece of the puzzle.
I bet that's how the investigators feel, too. It brings us back to that question that's been hanging over everything we've talked about today. What if the answer isn't in the evidence itself, but in how we're looking at it?
So you're saying we might need to totally rethink this case, consider new perspectives, and really question all our assumptions.
Exactly. What if we've been focused on the wrong things? What about the bigger picture, the social and cultural context of Anonet's disappearance? We've talked about the issues surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous people and how they've been overlooked. Could those bigger forces be hiding the truth?
It's easy to get lost in the details and forget about those bigger societal factors, you know? It makes me wonder if things would be different if this investigation had been handled differently from the beginning, with more awareness and sensitivity to the cultural context.
It's a tough question, but it's something we have to think about. And it should change how we approach these cases going forward. We have to learn from the past and do better.
That's a powerful statement. So here we are after all of this incredible information and discussion. Anonet's case is still unsolved. It's a reminder of how complicated these investigations can be and how these tragedies affect families and communities for years and years.
I think you summed it up perfectly. And even though we might never know exactly what happened, I believe it's important to keep asking those questions. Keep the conversation alive. Never give up hope that one day there will be justice for Anonet.
Well said. And to our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep digging into this case yourselves. The information you've gathered is a great starting point.
What other insights or connections can you make?
What have we missed?
Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from looking at things with fresh eyes and being willing to challenge the usual way of thinking.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the disappearance of Anonet Cayito. We hope this has given you new things to think about and maybe even inspired you to keep searching for answers.
Until next time, stay curious and keep asking those tough questions.